All right, well, greetings to all of you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your meeting. And Joe, thank you so much for all the work you did in organizing this event. I'm going to go ahead and start to share my screen so that way we can see the PowerPoint presentation while I speak. So if you just give me one moment to do that and pull up my PowerPoint. Here we go. Okay, so can you guys see that okay? Good, good. All right, well, I really wish I could be there with you guys face to face. As Joe said, you know, my mom's from Mandan and my mom's grandparents, my great-grandparents are from Glen, and some of the best memories I have as a young child were the summers that we would spend in Mandan with my grandparents. So I have a fondness in North Dakota. Really is very much part of my heart. So I wish I could be there with you guys face to face, but because that's not possible, I guess a live stream is the next best thing to being there in person. I was born in 1963, and I know I don't look that old. But actually, I was born February 1963, and November of 1963 was really a rather tragic event in American history, and that was the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And what's interesting is that, oops, somehow I'm not able to change my... And what's interesting about that event in our nation's history is it really changed America. And it changed the way that people viewed America as Americans. And, you know, it was such a profound event that I remember growing up as a kid, I would talk to adults and they could tell me in vivid detail where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news that JFK was assassinated. And if there was an event that rivals the Kennedy assassination in our generation, I would say it was the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And I can remember exactly where I was and exactly what I was doing when I saw the Twin Towers collapse on live TV. And that, of course, changes the way that we view America. It's changed our country, and not necessarily for the good. And it's interesting because kids that are 17 years old or younger have never known an America prior to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And so the America that our children are growing up in is very different than the America that I grew up in and that probably many of us grew up in.
It's his PowerPoint.
Oh, it's just blank?
Yeah, his
Yeah.
PowerPoint.
So anyway, after the aftermath of this 9/11 event, of course, was quite chaotic. And I can remember a very famous press conference held by Donald Rumsfeld, who at that time was the Secretary of Defense. And Rumsfeld was trying to assess the terrorist threats that were facing the United States. And this is what he said. He said, there are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we now know we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we do not know we do not know. And of course, what he's getting at is in life, many times there are things we know, there's things we know we don't know, but what is most concerning is always those things that we don't know. And this is not only true when it comes to the threat of terrorism, this is also true when it comes to assessing the evolutionary paradigm. Because interestingly enough, when Darwin advanced his theory of evolution, most of what we know today about modern biology was simply unknown to Darwin. He simply didn't even know what he didn't know when he advanced his theory of evolution. And so the question is, if Darwin knew then what we know now about modern biology, would he have advanced his theory of evolution, Or would he have advanced his theory of evolution as an all-encompassing theory of biology? Because it's not just simply the fact that Darwin's theory attempts to explain the origin of species, but in fact, Darwin's theory is considered by many people to be the organizing principle in all biology. And this was the maneuver that Darwin made with Origin of Species, is he argued that the mechanism that could explain the origin of species through natural selection, if extended over long periods of time, could explain the origin of major groups, could explain the diversity of life that we see on Earth today and throughout Earth's history. It could explain what's called the biogeographical distribution of organisms, and it could even explain the design that we see in biology. And so what Darwin did with his theory is he revolutionized biology. Prior to Darwin, people viewed the design in biological systems as the work of a mind. After Darwin, people viewed the design in biology as the work of mechanism, and mechanism alone. And so for many people, because Darwin's theory claims that everything in biology can be explained mechanistically, that for many people who are people of faith, Christians, we oftentimes view Darwin's theory as a threat or an idea that fits uncomfortably with our faith, because if mechanism can explain everything, then what role is there for a creator? And there are many people who are skeptics who reject the truth claims of the Christian faith for that very reason. In fact, Richard Dawkins, the well-known atheist, wrote once that Darwin's theory makes it possible to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. In other words, Darwin's theory justifies an atheistic worldview. And so the question then is, when we assess the evolutionary paradigm, and particularly this grand claim that everything in biology can be explained by evolution, it's important to keep in mind what Darwin knew when he advanced this theory and what he didn't know. And what we'll discover is that what Darwin didn't know actually has important bearing on the validity of the grand claim of the evolutionary paradigm that we're going to be talking about. And the first place that I want to start as we do this assessment of Darwin's theory in light of what he knew and what he didn't know is look at the origin of life question. And by the way, if you're interested, there's a little booklet that Hugh Ross and I co-authored called What Darwin Didn't Know. And so some of what I'm presenting today comes from this booklet. Other material that I'm presenting today comes from other works that I've published or from articles that are available that I've published on our website at reasons.org. So if you want to dig deeper, there's a number of places that you can go. But we wrote this little booklet in response to the celebration. Every year on February 12th, Darwin Day is celebrated around the world. This is Darwin's birthday. And in 2009, it was Darwin's 200th, or the anniversary, I should say, of his 200th birthday, but it was also the 150th year anniversary of Origin of Species. And so the Darwin Day celebrations around the world were really very prominent because of those two anniversaries. And so in response, we wrote this booklet, What Darwin Didn't Know, which is kind of the framework for this talk that I'm giving this afternoon. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the question of the origin of life. Now in Origin of Species, Darwin did not address the origin of life question. He basically assumed that there was the very first organism on Earth, and from that organism, all life essentially descended. This idea is called universal common descent. But Darwin, as I mentioned, argued that this mechanism that could explain the origin of species could not only explain the entirety or the totality of life's history and the fundamental design of life, but Darwin actually felt that this very mechanism could even explain the origin of life itself, which is the emergence of the very first cells, the very first life forms on Earth, starting with simple chemical materials. And so in a letter to his close friend, Joseph Hooker, who was a well-known botanist in Darwin's day, he wrote a letter where he said this: "The first spark of life may have taken place in a warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, lights, heat, electricity, and so forth present, so that a protein compound was chemically formed ready to undergo still more complex changes. So here Darwin introduces this idea of this evolutionary process taking place even at the chemical scale. Sometimes this is called chemical evolution, where Darwin envisioned evolutionary mechanisms could even organize the very first chemicals on the earth into the very first cellular entities. Now, this idea was largely left unexplored for almost probably 50, 60 years until the 1920s, when J.B.S. Haldane, who's on the left, who was a British geneticist, and Alexander Oparin, a Russian biochemist, on the right, independently proposed detailed mechanisms for how chemicals could self-organize into the very first cells. And this today is referred to as the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis. And this is, in a sense, forms the organizing framework for how people think about the origin of life problem today. This idea proposed in the 1920s, again, was a nice idea that was not evaluated until the 1950s with the work of Stanley Miller. And today, if you pick up a biology textbook, the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis is oftentimes presented in this way, in a more contemporary way that, again, is a typical textbook presentation, where on the early Earth, there were atmospheric molecules, small gaseous molecules, that reacted under energy in response to energetic events on the early Earth that produced compounds called prebiotic molecules, small organic materials that would accumulate in the Earth's oceans or some environment on the Earth, forming a prebiotic soup. And that within this soup, these molecules would react to form more complex molecules that would function as the building blocks of life. And then those building block materials would react with each other to form more complex polymeric materials. They would begin to aggregate to form protocellular structures, and that these protocells in turn would then evolve to give rise to the very first true cells. And those true cells would continue this evolutionary process, culminating with what's called LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. And from there, biological evolution kicks in. And so LUCA is kind of the transition point between the origin of life and between biological evolution. Now, many times people will argue that the evolutionary paradigm is not does not include the origin of life, that biological evolution is distinct from the origin of life. And I would actually disagree with that, because in a sense, in the evolutionary paradigm, people view the origin of life to the history of life as being a continuum, where the events that shape LUCA as a result of the origin of life in turn are going to be imprinted on the entire history of life when you view this in evolutionary terms. And where the origin of life process ends and biological evolution begins is really kind of a gray area. It's not really, there's not a sharp demarcation. And again, Darwin himself speculated that there could be a form of chemical evolution that was like the type of evolution he proposed to account for all of biology. And so I would argue that the origin of life really is properly understood as part of the evolutionary paradigm. And so this idea of Alexander Oparin and J.B.S. Haldane was first evaluated experimentally in the 1950s by Stanley Miller, who was a graduate student in the chemistry lab of the Nobel laureate Harold Urey. And at that time, people thought that the early Earth's atmosphere would have been devoid of oxygen and would have consisted of ammonia, methane, and water vapor. And so Miller tried to simulate the conditions of the early Earth, where he had a flask of boiling water that represented the Earth's oceans. That boiling water would have introduced water vapor into the headspace. He had ammonia, methane, hydrogen gas in the headspace. Again, was very careful to exclude oxygen from the apparatus, and then had a continuous electrical discharge that was presumably to model lightning on the early Earth. And in very short order, he actually produced amino acids, which are the building block materials for proteins, as well as compounds called alpha hydroxy acids and some other organic materials. And so people saw this as experimental validation of the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis, and this inaugurated prebiotic chemistry as a discipline within science, where the goal of prebiotic chemistry is try to understand in chemical terms the different steps that would have taken place to go from simple chemical materials to the very first cells, where those steps are modeled in the laboratory under simulated early Earth conditions. And today, prebiotic chemistry is a very vibrant area of scientific research and has been for the last 70 years. So people saw this as justification, as validation of Darwin's idea of life emerging in a warm little pond. But in the intervening years, people have now come to recognize the Miller-Urey experiment and related experiments as being irrelevant to the origin of life question. Why is that? Because the conditions that Miller used in his experiment are not the conditions that would have existed on the early Earth. We now know that instead of the atmosphere being made up of ammonia, methane, water, and hydrogen, it would have been made up of carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water. And in that particular gas mixture, electrical discharges essentially do nothing. No chemistry takes place. And the reason is because that gas mixture is oxidizing. It is energetically depleted versus the other gas mixture that Miller used, which is energy enriched or reducing gases. And so the point is that people no longer consider Miller's work meaningful for the origin of life question because he didn't get the conditions right on the early Earth. Though people would still argue that his experiment is historically relevant, it is scientifically irrelevant. And the problem that with the Miller-Urey experiment, in effect, reverberates through all of prebiotic chemistry today. And it is true that, again, there's been 70 years of work in prebiotic chemistry, and on the surface, if you ask somebody that is familiarity with the origin of life problem and the work being done, they will take the view that, oh, we're really very close to understanding the origin of life, because they'll point to other experiments that are analogous to the Miller-Urey experiments, where people have been able to make not only amino acids, but all other sorts of building block materials for life. They've been able to synthesize under quote unquote simulated Earth conditions, biopolymers. They can evolve these biopolymers into ion junctional molecules. They can generate protocells. They can generate self-replicating systems. And so their point would be that this is indicating that that it's conceivable that life could have indeed emerged on the early Earth as Darwin envisioned it through a form of chemical evolution. The problem here becomes evident when we begin to think about what is it that people are doing when they do these laboratory simulation experiments. And the first thing that people are doing is just trying to determine if indeed the chemistry or the physics that is needed for a particular step in the origin of life even is possible. This would be proof of principle experiments. They also then want to understand what are the mechanisms, the physical chemical principles that guide that particular chemistry or that particular physical process. And then they need to show geochemical plausibility for the reactions that they've discovered in the lab. And this is where the Miller-Urey experiment becomes irrelevant, because his work is not geochemically plausible. The laboratory work doesn't match the conditions of the early Earth. And this is the problem that is universally plaguing a prebiotic chemistry and the origin of life problem. Because in order to do proper geochemical simulations, you need to make sure that you actually are working with the appropriate types of starting materials that would be present on the early Earth and at their appropriate concentrations. You need to make sure that the energy sources that you're using in your experiment are actually appropriate given the conditions of the early Earth, that you need to make sure that chemical products are stable long enough to affect subsequent steps in the process. Chemical interference must be taken into account. That is, the early Earth would have been a very chemically diverse environment. So you need to make sure that you take that into account, because many times that chemical diversity would interfere otherwise with the chemistry that you've identified in the lab. And then also on top of that, you need to make sure that researchers have not involved themselves in the experimental design in such a way that they become critical to the success of the experiment. And this is a real problem today in origin of life research. That, in other words, researcher involvement may be actually key for the success of some of these prebiotic simulation studies that we briefly mentioned. And now, of course, if you're doing an experiment in a laboratory, researchers have to be involved. You can't do an experiment if a researcher isn't setting up the experiment. But the question is, when does that involvement cross the line where the researcher becomes an integral part of the experimental design? So again, as I mentioned, there's some steps that are absolutely necessary for the researcher's involvement, but there's other steps or interventions that the researchers can take that actually become illegitimate, like carefully controlling the temperature or the pH, or controlling the concentrations of the starting materials, ensuring that there's no interfering materials in the reaction, controlling the order of addition, the timing of addition of the different reactants, and things like that. This becomes now places where the researchers have entered into the experimental design. And to illustrate this more concretely, I want to very briefly talk about a very important set of experiments that many people think validates what's called the RNA world hypothesis. This is an idea that has become one of the major ideas in origin of life research. For many people, this is the most prominent idea for how life would have originated. And they argue that the very first organisms were RNA-based, and that these RNA life forms then later evolved to give rise to the DNA protein life forms that we're familiar with today. And we don't need to get into the details. People believe that there's some justification for this hypothesis. One of those pieces of evidence that people will point to in support of the RNA world is the assembly of RNA on mineral surfaces. Now, in the 1990s, there was a series of experiments that were done for the first time where people showed you could take RNA building blocks, add them to an aqueous solution that was bathing clay minerals, and that the clay could catalyze the production of RNA polymers. And people thought, well, on the early Earth, if there were clay minerals that were present, that they could serve as places that could sequester these building blocks and catalyze the formation of RNA. So this was heralded as being a very important contribution to the RNA world hypothesis. The problem is, when you examine these studies in detail, first of all, these researchers were working with chemically pristine conditions. They did not include materials that would have been present on the early Earth that would have inhibited RNA formation on clay or would have caused its breakdown once it formed. On top of that, these researchers stopped the growth of the RNA polymer chains at the just right point in time, preventing them from getting too long, because if those chains got too long, they would irreversibly absorb onto the clay surface. And once that happens, they have been removed from the origin of life process. Additionally, people have to use clay from a particular source and treat it in a particular way, and they have to use chemically activated nucleotides that make the nucleotides or the RNA building blocks much more likely to react. So the point is that if it wasn't for the involvement of the researchers, the RNA would not assemble on clay surfaces. The researchers were a critical component in the success of this experiment. Paul Davies, an origin of life researcher and a physicist, said this: as far as biochemists can see, it is a long and difficult road to produce efficient RNA replicators from scratch. This conclusion has to be that without a trained organic chemist on hand to supervise, nature would be struggling to make RNA from a dilute soup under any plausible prebiotic conditions. Simon Conway Morris, an origin of life researcher, an evolutionary biologist, in his book Life Solution says this: many of the experiments designed to explain one or other step in the origin of life are either of tenuous relevance to any believable prebiotic setting or involve an experimental rig in which the hand of the researcher becomes, for all intents and purposes, the hand of God. So the first point here that I want to make is this, that when it comes to the origin of life, Darwin speculated that the origin of life could take place in a warm little pond, applying the principles of natural selection to chemical evolution. And even though this idea has, again, a very rich history since Darwin proposed this notion of a warm little pond, the fact of the matter is today we are seeing a crisis in origin of life research where it looks as if the researcher involvement has been unwarranted in these experiments, to the point where the researchers are contributing to the success of the experiment. And that if Darwin knew this, would he have suggested that life could have evolved from a warm little pond? But what's also intriguing is that these very same studies that are exposing what I think to be the Achilles heel of prebiotic chemistry, at the same time are giving us evidence that if there's not an intelligent agent involved, chemicals cannot transform into the very first cells. That in other words, these problems that we're exposing to the evolutionary paradigm at the same time provide, ironically, evidence for the handiwork of a creator or the role of a creator in the origin of life. Okay, now let's move on and talk a little bit about Darwin's view of the cell. Now, Darwin, to my knowledge, didn't write anything specifically about the cell, other than to assume that the very first life forms were simple cellular organisms that gave rise, again, to all life on Earth through his evolutionary processes. But in Darwin's day, the view of the cell was very different than our view today. In Darwin's day, the view of the cell was defined by something called the protoplasmic theory, which viewed a cell as a very simple entity consisting of a cell wall that is typically conceived of as being a relatively simple chemical material that formed the cell wall, a nucleus which nobody quite understood what it was, and then the cytoplasm being a homogeneous jelly-like material produced from, again, a single type of compound that wound up forming a gel-like structure. And so if you think about this view of the cell, which is a very simple view of the cell, it's not hard to envision how maybe something like Darwin's theory of life emerging in a warm little pond would make sense. But of course, the intervening years, we now have a very different view of the cell, that the protoplasm is not a simple gel-like material, but it's an incredibly chemically complex system and we've characterized that complexity through a whole wide range of techniques that have ushered in essentially the molecular biology revolution, where we understand life in chemical terms. We understand what's going on in the cell at a chemical level. And what we see is, again, complexity that is impossible to actually properly describe. The complexity of the cell is literally mind-blowing. But it's not just simply the complexity that I think begins to raise questions about the evolutionary framework. It's the nature of that complexity. As we've learned about biochemical systems, we've come to recognize that the defining features of biochemical systems, their hallmark characteristics, are identical to those characteristics that we would recognize to be the work of a human designer. In other words, when human beings design, when we create, we invent systems or objects or devices, those things that we make have certain telltale properties that reflect the work of a mind. And these, ironically, are the same properties that define biochemistry itself, which to me, by analogy, suggests that biochemistry too must be the work of a mind. That is, that the fundamental design of life cannot be explained by evolutionary mechanisms, but requires the work of a mind. On top of that, there are certain systems in the cell that are eerie in their similarity to man-made systems. And I'm going to talk about two of them very briefly this afternoon. One of them are what are called molecular machines or biomolecular machines. These are massive protein complexes that literally are functioning like the machines that we would build. Their architecture and their operation is identical to the machines that we would build as human designers. This is complexity that is squared, that to the highest degree, to the highest order. And this is an example of one of these biomolecular machines. This is a very important protein complex called ATP synthase that is ubiquitous in nature. It's found in the plasma membranes of bacteria and archaea and in the inner membrane of mitochondria. And it is a protein complex that generates energy for the cell to use. It is arguably one of the most important proteins in all of biochemistry. And this compound is called ATP synthase or F1F0 ATPase. Now, to give you a better context for what we're going to be talking about, a very quick review of biochemistry is in order. And this is showing a typical cartoon of an animal cell that you would see in a biology textbook. And again, when you look at the interior of the cell, it's very clear that the protoplasmic theory of the cell is really wrong. But what I want to focus on for our purposes is a very thin envelope called the cell membrane that separates the interior of the cell from the exterior environment. You can barely even see the outline of the cell membrane in this diagram of the cell. But if we blow it up and just look at a little piece of that cell membrane, a little cutaway, we see what biochemists call is a supramolecular diagram. The idea here is that this shows the overall shapes of molecules and how those molecules interact with each other to form higher order structures in the cell. And so the membrane is a sheet comprised of two layers of molecules called phospholipids, and embedded in those sheets are these larger molecules called proteins. So the F1F0 ATPase is embedded in membranes of bacteria and the inner membrane of mitochondria. So this would be where the F1F0 ATPase would be localized in the cell. Now, these larger structures, again, are called proteins, and they carry out all kinds of different activities in the cell and give the membrane its functional properties. Proteins themselves are complex molecules. This is a cartoon showing the different level of protein structures. And proteins are made by linking together amino acids. And by the way, these were some of the compounds that were formed in the Miller-Urey experiment, which is why everybody was excited about those results. And those amino acids are linked together to form a protein chain that then folds into a precise three-dimensional shape. And then that folded chain can interact with other folded chains to form a complex. Here we're seeing four folded protein chains called subunits interacting to form this complex. Now, this is again the F1F0 ATPase shown embedded in the membrane. And this is an electrically powered rotary motor that operates at near 100% efficiency. It's a frictionless motor. And the pie-like structure embedded in the membrane that's brown or tan is the motor. And there are hydrogen ions which flow through channels in this protein motor. And a hydrogen ion is positively charged. The flow of charge is current. So as current flows through the motor, it causes it to rotate. That rotation drives the rotation of a rotor, which has a cam at a right angle that interacts with the turbine, which are these alternating green and blue ovals. And as it interacts with the turbine, it causes a mechanical displacement that drives the chemical reaction that forms ATP. And this red rod is the stator that's holding everything in place. This is, again, identical to a rotary motor that we would build. And this is showing this rotary motor in action. So just note the machine-like properties of this motor. So absolutely amazing, is it not? When you look at, again, the complexity that we see inside the cell. This is just one individual component, and we could talk about hundreds and hundreds of molecular motors that are like the F1F0 ATPase that are part of the protoplasm, the complexity of the protoplasm. Now, also on top of that, biochemical systems are information systems. And for example, proteins are information harboring molecules, as is DNA. DNA is a molecule that stores information that is used to essentially build the cell and then direct the cell's operations. So the instructions to build the proteins like the F1F0 ATPase are encoded in the DNA molecule. And the DNA molecule is, in effect, digital information. And it turns out that the way that the cell's machinery accesses that digital information in DNA is identical to the way that a computer system operates. That there are a number of different processes in the cell that involve the digital information in DNA, and all of these processes literally are computer operations that are taking place inside the cell. And to appreciate that, we need to reflect on the work of Alan Turing, who was a British mathematician who in the 1930s developed the theoretical framework for computer science. And Turing was trying to determine how a machine could carry out complex computations. And he devised this abstract machine called a Turing machine that consists of an input and an output and a finite control. And this is a cartoon showing a Turing machine where the input is digital data that is fed into a finite control that alters that digital data in a prescribed manner, and then in turn creates a digital output. And Turing realized that the output of one Turing machine could become the input to another Turing machine, and by catenating Turing machines together, very complex computations could be carried out. And this is the theoretical foundation for how computer systems operate. And so when we look at a process like DNA replication, which is illustrated in this cartoon, we see the DNA double helix being replicated into two daughter helices. The digital information is being replicated, and you see all these different protein machines that are taking the digital information from DNA, altering it, producing an output strand that is then in turn operated on by another Turing machine. And that process is brought together to carry out a very complex computation, which is to replicate the digital instructions in DNA into two sets of digital instructions that can be partitioned to daughter cells after cell division takes place. And again, let's watch a video showing the operation of these Turing machines during DNA replication. So what we've seen here is, again, instead of these conceptual abstract machines that existed in Turing's mind, we see physical instantiations of these Turing machines in the fundamental operations that take place inside the cell. The cell is a very elaborate computer system. The protoplasm of the cell is a very elaborate computer system. And in fact, the similarity between what happens during DNA replication and the operation of a computer system is so stark that it's given birth to a whole new area of nanotechnology called DNA computing, where people are literally building computers using DNA and the molecules that manipulate DNA, that's what the computer system consists of. And they're housed in these little tiny Eppendorf test tubes, and they're more powerful than the most powerful silicon-based supercomputer system that we have built to date. And this is what Leonard Adleman says, who's considered the father of DNA computing. He says this: the most important thing about DNA computing is that it shows that DNA molecules can do what we normally think only computers can do. This implies that computer science and biology are closely related, that every living thing can be thought to be computing something, and that sometimes we can understand living things better by looking at them as computers. And so, in other words, again, what we're seeing here is this incredible complexity inside the cell. And given this complexity, I think it's fair to ask if Darwin really understood that this was the level of complexity that existed inside the cell. Would he have been willing to suggest that his evolutionary mechanisms could somehow explain the origin of life emerging out of a warm little pond? Would he claim that evolutionary mechanisms could somehow account for the fundamental design of life on Earth? I wonder if that's the case. But what's also interesting is that these insights can actually be used to not only challenge Darwin's theory in the evolutionary paradigm in a broad sense, but we can actually use these insights to make a case for a creator's role in the origin and the design of life by following in the footsteps of William Paley and revitalizing the watchmaker argument for God's existence. And this argument goes back to the late 1700s in a book called Natural Theology, where William Paley, who was a British natural theologian and Anglican, presented this argument for God's existence. And what Paley argued is that if you compare a rock to a watch and ask where each of them came from, the answer that you would give is very different. A rock could be easily explained through the outworkings and natural processes, but a watch requires a different explanation. It requires a watchmaker to explain its origin. Why? Because there's an artificiality to a watch. There are these parts that seem like they've been conceived and then designed and fabricated to interact precisely to accomplish a purpose. And that if any one of those parts didn't interact precisely or was absent, that system wouldn't function. And so Paley argued that that kind of system reflects the work of a mind. And then when he surveyed biological systems and what was known about them in his day, he concluded that they have more in common with a watch than with a rock, and therefore life must require a divine watchmaker. And I think it's easy to see how these molecular motors and DNA computers actually revitalize the watchmaker argument for God's existence. And what's interesting is that when Darwin wrote on the origin of species, he had the watchmaker argument of William Paley in mind, where he tried to argue that the design that Paley argued for doesn't require a sighted watchmaker, an intelligent agent, a mind, but rather the unguided, undirected processes of evolution. The unguided, undirected processes of evolution could explain that design. But when we look at, again, the molecular motors that we see inside the cell, the DNA computers that we see inside the cell, it's really questionable if indeed the blind watchmaker could truly account for the fundamental design of life, particularly in light of some of the problems that we identified with original life explanations. Okay, let's move on now and talk about the fossil record. Darwin was a consummate scientist. He was a really very good, very accomplished scientist. And as a good scientist, when Darwin proposed his theory of evolution and presented a case for his theory, he was also fair-minded to include what he saw to be difficulties or problems with his theory. In fact, there's an entire chapter in Origin of Species devoted to what Darwin called the problems with his theory. And one of those problems related to the nature of the fossil record. And I'm not going to elaborate on all of the different problems Darwin identified with respect to the fossil record, other than to point out a feature of the fossil record that deeply troubled Darwin, and this was relating to what are known as the Cambrian strata of rocks. In the Cambrian layers of rocks, what we see are the very first appearance of complex animal forms. In the rock layers immediate below the Cambrian, in the Precambrian rock layers immediate below the Cambrian layers, there's no fossil evidence whatsoever. And Darwin was deeply troubled by this because this pattern where these animal forms suddenly appear seemed to be contrary to what his theory would predict. And this is what he writes. There's another and allied difficulty which is much more serious. I allude to the manner in which species belonging to several of the main divisions of the animal kingdom suddenly appear in the lowest known fossiliferous rocks. To the question why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earliest periods prior to the Cambrian system, I can give no satisfactory answer. Now, what Darwin did in his day was to appeal to the incompleteness of the fossil record. He basically argued that paleontology is in its infancy, that we've just barely begun to have studied geological formations. And he was convinced that the more that we would characterize the fossil record, that these missing fossils would be discovered and his theory would gain support. Well, here we are 160 plus years later, and we now know that the Cambrian explosion, which was what Darwin alluded to, is a real event in life's history. It's not an artifact of an incomplete fossil record. It's a real event where in a relatively narrow window of time, somewhere between 50 to 80% of all animal phyla to have ever existed appear. And this is called sometimes biology's Big Bang. And this event in life's history, it defies an evolutionary explanation at this point in time. In fact, this is what Doug Irwin and Jim Valentine write in their textbook on the Cambrian explosion. These are two of the world's leading authorities on the Cambrian explosion. And what they basically are arguing is that current evolutionary theory is incapable of explaining the Cambrian explosion, that there needs to be an expansion of evolutionary theory to accommodate the Cambrian explosion. They just simply don't know what mechanisms that would account for the Cambrian event or how the theory should be expanded. But this is what they write. One important concern has been that whether the microevolutionary pattern commonly studied in modern organisms by evolutionary biologists are sufficient to understand and explain the events of the Cambrian, or whether evolutionary theory needs to be expanded to include a more diverse set of macroevolutionary processes. We strongly hold to the latter position. The move from micro to macro forms a discontinuity. In other words, Darwin's mechanism of natural selection that can explain micro changes that can in species cannot be extrapolated to explain the origin of phyla. And if Darwin knew that, would he have been, again, so bold as to extend his theory to be the organizing principle in all of biology? Now, what's also interesting is that the Cambrian explosion not only represents a challenge to the evolutionary paradigm, but at the same time also, I think, is a signature for the work of a creator. And you can begin to get a sense of that when you read this interesting statement made by Richard Dawkins in The Blind Watchmaker, where he said, the Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years, are the oldest ones which we find most of the major invertebrate groups, and we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. It's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. In other words, what would it look like if a creator brought animal life into existence? Wouldn't it look like suddenly these creatures appear out of nowhere without any kind of evolutionary history? And in fact, when I think of the Cambrian explosion, I'm immediately drawn to the fifth day of creation, which says, let the waters teem with life. God declaring that the waters should teem with life. An eerie similarity. And the point that I want to make now is this, that it's not just limited or confined to the Cambrian explosion. Every key transition in the history of life on Earth occurs explosively, suddenly, without any kind of intermediate grades documenting that transition. And in fact, this is the conclusion of Eugene Koonin, a bioinformaticist at the National Institutes of Health, in an article he published a few years ago in Biology Direct, where he basically describes the entire history of life as being, in a sense, a sequence of Big Bang events, similar to the Cambrian explosion. And again, this pattern to me is a pattern I would expect if a creator is responsible for orchestrating the history of life on Earth. Now, another difficulty that Darwin spoke about in Origin of Species are what he calls organs of extreme perfection. And the example that Darwin uses to illustrate why this on the surface appears to be a problem for his theory is the camera eye of vertebrates. And the reason why Darwin focused on this is because in Natural Theology, William Paley begins one of his chapters with this, where he talks about the eye with this statement, that if there was no other example that we had other than the camera eye of vertebrates, on that example alone, we would be justified in concluding that a creator must be responsible for life, because that design of the camera eye is so exquisite. And so Darwin, as a rejoinder, basically wrote this famous passage where he argued that something even as complex as the eye could be generated by natural selection. That natural selection could explain even the exquisite design of something like the vertebrate eye. And this is what he said: if numerous gradations from a perfect and complex eye to one very imperfect and simple, each grade being useful to its possessor, can be shown to exist, if further the eye does vary ever so slightly, and the variations be inherited, which is certainly the case, and if any variation or modification in the organ be ever useful to an animal under changing conditions of life, then the difficulty of believing that a perfect complex eye could be formed by natural selection, though insuperable by our imagination, can hardly be considered real. In other words, Darwin argued that if the eye could emerge through a gradual stepwise process, that natural selection could produce something even as complex as an eye. And this is kind of a classic illustration showing how Darwin envisioned the evolutionary origin of the eye, where if you began with photoreceptors on the surface of the skin, the ability to detect light would be an advantage to that organism, and therefore would persist. And then if there was an invagination, that you could begin to determine the directionality of the light in addition to detecting the light. And again, if as the nervous system became more advanced and complex, that there could be other structures that could gradually appear that would now not only allow for detection of light, but the detection of images. Again, that would be an advantage and would take hold, and that over time, evolutionary processes could even produce something as complex as the eye. Now, there's a lot of ways to respond to this, but one way is to look at the phyla that actually have the capacity for vision, that have eyes. And these are the phyla that show the capacity for vision. And it turns out that these phyla all have representatives in the Cambrian explosion. In other words, when we look at the fossil record, we don't see animals appearing in a gradual, stepwise manner, in a gradual, sequential manner, where these organisms with eye spots and then simple, crude eyes that become more complex, we don't see that pattern in the fossil record. We see everything that has visual capability showing up all at once, regardless of the complexity of the visual system. And in fact, we now are beginning to develop some fossil evidence that indicates that the compound eyes of arthropods actually show up in the Cambrian explosion. that we now have fossil evidence of compound eyes. For example, a fossil of Anomalocaris shows a compound eye, as does a fossil of a trilobite. And so the point here is this, is that there isn't an evolution of eyes documented in the fossil record from simple to complex, but everything shows up all at once at the same time. And that when it comes to arthropods, the eyes that appear with the very first appearance of arthropods in the fossil record are identical to the compound eyes that are in arthropods today. There's no evolution of eyes in accordance to what Darwin proposed. So in other words, the fossil record doesn't support his explanation for the evolutionary origin of something like the camera eye of a vertebrate. Okay, I'm going to take on one other topic very quickly, and then we'll open up the floor for a time of Q&A and discussion. And I want to talk about now the question of human origins. Now, in The Origin of Species, Darwin was very careful not to discuss the question of human origins. And this was done intentionally on Darwin's part because he did not want people to reject his theory of evolution because of the idea of human importance or human exceptionalism at that time. That he felt like if he brought up the idea of human evolution in his book, that people would react so negatively to that idea that it would undermine acceptance of his theory. So he wanted people to first accept his theory, and then later on he applied his theory to the question of human origins in a book called The Descent of Man, where he basically argued that humans, like all life on Earth, are the product of an evolutionary history, and that everything that we think makes us exceptional as human beings actually has its antecedents in the creatures that precede us in the history of life on Earth. And so he writes these famous words where he says, in a series of forms graduating insensibly from some ape-like creature to man as he now exists, it would be impossible to fix on any definite point when the term man ought to be used. And as a result of that, people have argued that, again, there's nothing really special about human beings. We differ in degree from other creatures, not in kind. That the behavior that we think makes us special has its antecedents in the great apes and in the hominins that precede us in the fossil record. And this view has shaped anthropology for 150 years. And yet today we see a growing minority of anthropologists who are pushing back against this idea, who are arguing for something called human exceptionalism. They argue that we really are different in kind, not degree, from other creatures, that there's something fundamentally different about us that separates us from all other creatures. And one of those scientists who holds that view is Thomas Suddendorf, who in his book, The Gap, writes these words: "We reflect on and argue about our present situation, our history and destiny. We envision wonderful harmonious worlds as easily as we do dreadful tyrannies. Our powers are used for good as they are for bad, and we incessantly debate which is which. Our minds have spawned civilizations and technologies that have changed the face of the earth, while our closest living animal relatives sit unobtrusively in their remaining forest. There appears to be a tremendous gap between human and animal minds." Now, at one level, it may seem as if Suddendorf is stating the obvious. But what he's saying is rather profound from an evolutionary standpoint, because he's saying that even though humans and chimpanzees shared a common ancestor, that ancestor gave rise to two lineages: one, the chimps that are on the verge of extinction, and the others are human beings who have literally changed the face of the earth with our technology, who have put human beings on the moon. And Suddendorf argues there's got to be something fundamentally different about humans and the great apes to explain that. And he and other scientists argue that what explains human exceptionalism is our capacity for symbolism, our ability to represent the world symbolically and to communicate those symbols with language and music and art, and then to manipulate those symbols to create alternate scenarios. and then to link our minds together through a capacity called theory of mind, so that we can then leverage our individual abilities collectively in social constructs, and that this combination of properties makes us unique or exceptional. It separates us from all other creatures. That is, human beings really are exceptional. We're different in kind, not different in degree. And then on top, now, if you know anything about anthropology, you might be asking, well then, what about Neanderthals? Maybe this is true for humans and chimps, but what about Neanderthals? Because aren't there claims Neanderthals made art, made jewelry, made music, had language, they buried their dead, they mastered fire? Well, all these claims are in the scientific literature, but none of those claims withstand ongoing scientific scrutiny. They all come up short. They don't withstand, again, ongoing scientific investigation. And so there's no evidence whatsoever that Neanderthals were anything like us. In fact, one of the most compelling arguments I've ever seen for human exceptionalism and for the inferior cognitive ability of Neanderthals in comparison is an argument made by Noam Chomsky and Ian Tattersall, where they look at the trajectory of technology. And they point out that our species was born in a technologically archaic context. Significantly, the tempo of change only began picking up at the point at which symbolic objects appeared. Evidently, a new potential for symbolic thought was born with our anatomically distinctive species, but it was only expressed after the necessary cultural stimulus had exerted itself. This stimulus was most plausibly the appearance of language. Then within a remarkably short space of time, art was invented, cities were born, and people had reached the moon. And so the point here is this, is that when you look at the trajectory of our technology, it's clear that there's something very special about us as human beings, and that is likely related to our capacity for symbolism. When you look at Neanderthals' technology, it was crude and archaic, and it remained that way for the duration of their existence on Earth. In fact, these creatures were on Earth longer than we were, and they died out because, arguably, of their inferior cognitive abilities. And so this difference in trajectory argues that humans, again, are even distinct compared to Neanderthals. Now, we've been talking about the fact that language seems to be the defining feature when it comes to, again, human exceptionalism. And it turns out that evolutionary biologists cannot explain the origin of language through evolutionary terms or through evolutionary processes. And this is one of the outstanding problems in evolutionary biology. Christopher Knight says this in a journal article: language evolved in no other species than humans, suggesting a deep-seated going obstacle to its evolution. One possibility is that language simply cannot evolve in a Darwinian world, that is, in a world based ultimately on competition and conflict. The underlying problem may be that the communicative use of language presupposes anomalously high levels of mutual cooperation and trust, levels beyond anything which current Darwinian theory can explain, suggesting a deep-seated or deep-going obstacle to its evolution. But on top of that, when we look at the mode and the tempo for the origin of language, it again looks as if it's a signature for creation, because language looks as if it emerges suddenly. It coincides with the origin of humans. It's unique to humans. And the very first language appears to be as syntactically complex as modern day language. This is what a Japanese researcher by the name of Miyagawa says, who's from MIT. The hierarchical complexity found in present day language is likely to have been present in human language since its emergence. Tattersall and Schwartz say this: by this reckoning, the language faculty is an extremely recent acquisition in our lineage, and it was acquired not in the context of slow, gradual modification of pre-existing systems under natural selection, but in a single rapid emergent event that built upon. those prior systems, but was not predicted by them. The relatively sudden origin of language poses difficulties that may be called Darwin's problem. So in other words, would Darwin have argued that human beings are only different in degree, not kind, if he'd known what we know now about human exceptionalism and about the origin of language and the problems it poses trying to explain this origin in evolutionary terms? And what's, again, also interesting is that the very same features that seemingly undermine the evolutionary explanation can be viewed as signatures for a creation event. In fact, I would even argue that the features that seemingly are responsible for human exceptionalism are simply scientific descriptors of what we would understand to be the image of God. That is, the work in human exceptionalism provides a scientific case for human beings made in God's image. So, returning to our original question, if Darwin knew then what we know now, would he have advanced his theory of evolution? Would he, maybe he still would have advanced his explanation for the origin of species, but perhaps he might have been a little bit more circumspect about claiming that this mechanism could account for the origin of life, could account for the origin of humanity, and could account for the designs that we see in life and ultimately the entirety of life's history. And so, in fact, when you look at, again, the grand sweep of everything that's been discovered in biology, the origin of life, the fundamental nature of biochemical systems, again, the patterns that we see in the fossil record, even this idea of human exceptionalism, what we see are discoveries that I think fit very comfortably within a Christian worldview context. Discoveries that I think support the Christian worldview and even support the biblical creation accounts. So the interesting thing here is that by looking at what Darwin knew and what Darwin didn't know, by looking at Darwin's unknown unknowns, we begin to see really what I think are the limitations of the grand claim of the evolutionary paradigm, and at the same time, evidence for the handiwork of a creator. If you want to dig deeper into science-faith issues, one of our objectives at Reasons to Believe is to develop resources for you to be able to use, to just grow in your understanding of science-faith issues, to maybe grow in your confidence with respect to your faith, but also tools to help equip you to engage people who are skeptics, who question the credibility of the Christian worldview. And so if you want access to those resources, just text FUZZ to 31996, FUZZ to 31996, and this will take you to a portal that in turn will take you to a web page that will give you all kinds of materials at no cost to you, just as a way for us to say thank you for your interest in what we're doing at Reasons to Believe. So anyway, I'll be happy at this point to go ahead and take any kind of questions that you guys might have. So I'll go ahead and sharing the screen.
All right. And anybody here, if you have questions, what I'd ask you to do is come up here because that way there, Buzz can see you on the camera, and you can ask your questions. Anybody have any questions? All right. Why don't you give them your name?
Hello, Fuzz. This is Daryl Thompson. Fuzz, I'm curious if there is any information that would lead an individual to conclude that Darwin was biased in his research and that he was attempting to interpret his conclusions in such a way that would lead him to the conclusions that he presented in The Descent of Man to explain this process that would allow for an explanation that could be contrary and allow kind of a support for departing from a biblical understanding.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great question. And, you know, I mean, Darwin was, you know, a very accomplished naturalist and has done a lot, had accomplished a lot of work in the natural sciences, even prior to presenting his theory of evolution. So he was very well respected by his peers. But in his day, what was considered to be one of the chief scientific problems, it was called the mystery of mysteries, was the origin of species. So he, as well as other biologists, were working on that problem. And he and Alfred Russel Wallace independently discovered the idea of natural selection being the driving force for speciation. But Darwin was also motivated by other factors, as you alluded to, other than the scientific question. And this is where I think his explanation for the origin of species, while I think it was a legitimate scientific project, his use of that mechanism to then say that this could account for all the design in biology, that this mechanism could explain the entire history of life on Earth, could explain the origin of humanity, was probably motivated for philosophical or theological reasons, not scientific reasons. Because origin of species is a rejoinder to Paley's natural theology. When Darwin is writing that Origin of Species, he's responding to William Paley, and he's trying to undermine this idea that biological designs point to the necessity of a mind. He very much wanted mechanism to be front and center in biology, not teleology. And that was part of his motivation. But also, his daughter Anne died when she was 10 years old, and it was shortly after that he published on the Origin of Species. And a guy by the name of Cornelius Hunter has a book called Darwin's God that I would recommend to you if you want to dig deeper into this. And in this book, George Hunter basically argues that Darwin was presenting his theory of evolution as a theodicy, as a solution to the problem of evil, that he couldn't understand how a God who was all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful could allow tragedies like the death of his daughter, or could create a world that he saw as red in tooth and claw. And so he presents his theory of evolution as essentially a theodicy that is naturalistic in orientation. So the problem of evil deeply troubled Darwin and motivated him in large measure, I think, to present not so much his theory relating to the origin of species, but rather extrapolating that theory to, again, account for everything in biology. So yeah, he was motivated by things other than scientific factors.
Thank you, that's very helpful. My sense is that when our behaviors are not consistent with what we have been led to believe about life, there's a dissonance that is created, and you either adapt your behaviors or you adapt your beliefs. And what you've commented on has been helpful. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Hello, Fuzz. I'm Keith Schindler. I just want to say how much I enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
It was really good, really rich. There's one little area that I found interesting, though, that whole area of the Neanderthal, and that record and that history and the knowledge we have of that. And even though perhaps that was a longer span than human existence,
Yes.
it died out without society and things. Did you want to say any more about that, or where we could learn a little more about that?
Yeah, I sure could. Yeah, I've written quite a bit about Neanderthals and how they fit into the question of human origins in light of the biblical account of the origin of humanity in a book called Who Was Adam? So that's available through our website at reasons.org if you would like, or you can get it on Amazon as well. Also, if you go to our website at reasons.org and just type in Neanderthal, there are 50, 60 articles I've written over the years, essentially dealing with, again, the Neanderthal question. and particularly responding to the claims recently about Neanderthal exceptionalism. And, in light of the prior question, one of the things that I find really interesting is that there is a strong movement among anthropologists to try to make Neanderthals just like us as modern humans. This is called Neanderthal exceptionalism. And part of the reason is that even though there are evolutionary biologists like Sudendorf who are arguing that humans are exceptional, many anthropologists hate that idea. They're dragging their feet, kicking and screaming to acknowledge that human beings are exceptional. They don't want us to be, to be distinct or to stand apart from other creatures. And this is part of a naturalistic, materialistic worldview. And so in order to, again, kind of diminish the evidence for human exceptionalism, what they're trying to do is elevate Neanderthals to be like us. And so there is a very strong philosophical bias in terms of how people interpret data from the Neanderthal archaeological record. So they'll make claims that Neanderthals had capacity for symbolism, made art, engaged in religious practices. And when you look at the evidence that they build those interpretations upon, the evidence typically is really scant. But on top of that, many times there will be other investigators that will go back and reevaluate those claims and will actually produce data that refutes those claims, that outright refutes those claims. And what we see is Science in the news articles always emphasize the claims of Neanderthal exceptionalism and never ever report on the other studies that probably outweigh those studies that claim Neanderthal exceptionalism, and they never report on the other studies that show humans are exceptional and that Neanderthals were not like us. And so there's a very strong philosophical bias that influences how people interpret that data. If you show me a scientific paper and the list of the authors on that paper without the title or even showing me the abstract, I can tell you right away what they're going to conclude about Neanderthals just by looking at the authors. It's not an objective area of study whatsoever. And so, to me, Neanderthals are fascinating creatures that I think are, that I would view as part of God's creation, but I see them as creatures that were distinct from human beings biologically and behaviorally. I don't see them as our evolutionary predecessors whatsoever. So I just don't see them. I see them in the same vein as I would see, the great apes, that creatures that are intelligent, that had emotional capacities, but creatures that lack the image of God. And to me, the study on Neanderthal behavior from the archaeological record, as well as inferred behavior from the brain structural studies, all indicate that Neanderthals were nothing like us whatsoever.
Thank you. Yeah, that seems to be still a large chasm there.
Yeah, right.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is David Becker. I was just wondering, just appreciated hearing your presentation. Just if you could tell us a little about your own spiritual journey. I see in the program it says, studies the cellular systems, convinced of ever created his existence, and set him on a journey to faith in Christ. I know there's only probably a couple minutes left, but if you want to just share a little bit about that, I'd be interested in hearing that part too.
Yeah, sure. Just kind of in a nutshell, I was an agnostic as an undergraduate student. I didn't, know if God existed or not, and I didn't really care. I bought into the evolutionary framework wholesale as an undergraduate student. And when I went to graduate school, it was studying biochemistry that convinced me that there had to be a mind behind everything. And then that, sent me on a journey that culminated in my conversion to Christianity. So that's kind of the very short version of it. But I think if you, there's a, I'm sure that there's a more detailed version of that flying around somewhere in books or on our website if you want to dig a little bit deeper. But
let me see if anybody else have any questions? They don't. Why don't you explain a little bit, because we talk a lot about evolution here. Why don't you explain a little bit about how RTB approaches the idea of evolution and speciation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would be considered to be a skeptic of the evolutionary paradigm, but to me, I don't reject evolution outright, but just aspects or facets of the evolutionary paradigm. So, for example, I don't have any kind of issue with the idea that microorganisms evolve. I'm not troubled by the idea of microevolution or speciation. I would even allow the possibility that evolution could occur at the order of a genus or family. But I don't believe that evolutionary mechanisms can explain genuine biological innovation. To me, I think that's where the evolutionary mechanisms fall short. And so when you're looking at the origin of major groups or the origin of major transitions in the history of life, to me, those are places where it's very clear that a creator would have had to have intervened. And as I mentioned in the talk, when you talk about biology's big bangs, these are places where the life is going from one regime of complexity to another. And to me, again, that transition requires the input of a mind. And those are also places where you see those transitions happening explosively. So I'm very skeptical that evolutionary mechanisms could explain the origin of life, or again, things like the Cambrian explosion or the origin of eukaryotic cells, or even the origin of human exceptionalism. So, it's not an outright rejection of everything involving evolution, but rather really carefully evaluating the evidence at hand, and then also looking at what really are the boundaries or the limits that Scripture puts in place for us in terms of where God intervenes, or where God may have actually created through processes that He's ordained. So I'm open, but I'm also willing to be skeptical. Now, and then likewise, I don't have any problem with the history of life on Earth, the fossil record. I think that fossil record is a real description of life's history. That life does go from simple to complex, that there are different life forms at different eras in Earth's history, but I just simply don't think that the totality of the fossil record can be explained through evolutionary processes alone. It looks to me like, again, a creator has been involved at key points in the history of life.
Anybody else have anything? Oh, if not, then Buzz, I think we can thank you for sharing today with us. Let's see. And I'd like to thank GracePoint for allowing us to come in here and hold this event, and for Wendy helping out with the computer system, and Pastor Marty for helping us with getting this thing organized. So I guess that's about it, Fuzz, and we appreciate your time. So I guess we can say goodbye to you now.
All right, take care.